May the world become peaceful. May all men and women be gentle and honest. May all think of mutual welfare. May the minds of all be turned to the highest good. May there be devotion in the hearts of all to the Supreme Lord. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. The topic of today's lecture is Devamata, a Blessed One. That means that at the least, during the course of the next hour, I need to explain to you why Sister Devamata is in fact a Blessed One. It would probably be sufficient to say that in a letter from Swami Shivananda, he wrote that her work, quote, has taken place with the will of Sri Ramakrishna. You are a Blessed One. But there are many other reasons. So in the style of some of the evening news programs, which now give you the headlines in 60 seconds so that you don't change the channel, I'll give you some highlights of why Sister Devamata is indeed a Blessed One, with the hopes that you'll stay around for the details. Devamata went to all of Swami Vivekananda's lectures and classes in New York in 1895-96, including his last lecture there on My Master. Devamata edited Alan Waldo's notes of Swami Vivekananda's teachings at Thousand Island Park, which were published in 1908 as inspired talks. Swami Brahmananda asked her to write the preface. Devamata corresponded by letter with Holy Mother, Swami Brahmananda, Swami Premananda, and Swami Ramakrishnananda. So now that we've established that Sister Devamata was a Blessed One, we can move on to the details, which will explain just how blessed she really was. I'll also give you the teaser that I've left out, perhaps the greatest blessing of all, which we will hear about shortly. Sister Devamata was born to a prominent family in Cincinnati, Ohio, as Laura Franklin Glenn in September 1863. Her middle name reflected her mother's lineage back to Benjamin Franklin. A brilliant and able student, she graduated from Vassar College in 1882. Vassar in those years was associated with the social elite of the Protestant establishment. Her graduating thesis was on the rings of Saturn. Following graduation, she moved to Europe for 10 years, where she studied at the Sorbonne in Paris and other European academies. In 1893, Glenn and her mother and sister spent the month of June at the Chicago World's Fair, also known as the Chicago Columbian Exposition. They made plans to return in September for the World's Parliament of Religions, followed by a trip to Japan and the Orient. But as they were traveling from home to the Parliament in September, a death in the family aborted their trip, and they found themselves in a small town in Ohio. There, as a courtesy to the strangers, the Swedenborgian minister invited them to dinner. Interestingly, he had just returned from the Parliament and could talk of nothing else. He enthusiastically described to his guests various sessions at the Parliament, highlighting different delegates and their contributions. Glenn wrote, quote, "But," he continued, "there was one speaker who stood out above all others because of his learning, his eloquence, and his impressive personality. No other could compare with him except 2 or 3 Roman Catholic prelates, and they had sent their best." He paused, leaving his brilliant figure without name or nationality. "Who was he?" I asked eagerly. The minister replied quietly, "A Hindu, Swami Vivekananda." Glenn wrote that she was already prepared to be keenly interested, for she had read Edwin Arnold's Light of Asia about Buddha's life and teachings, and Mohini Chatterjee's translation of the Bhagavad Gita, where she looked up all of Chatterjee's references to parallel passages in the Bible. The previous winter, she had also spent many hours with Max Muller's English translation of the Upanishads. So she was very sympathetic to learning more about Indian teachings. In New York that autumn, the minister's conversation was not forgotten. Walking up Madison Avenue one day, a sign in the window of the Hall of the Universal Brotherhood caught her eye. Next Sunday at 3 p.m., Swami Vivekananda will speak here on what is Vedanta, and the following Sunday on what is yoga. Arriving 20 minutes before the hour, Glenn found the hall already more than half full. In her own words, quote, "By the time 3 o'clock had arrived, hall, stairs, windowsills, and railings all were crowded to their utmost capacity. Many even were standing below, hoping to catch a faint echo of the words spoken in the hall above. A sudden hush, a quiet step on the stairs, and Swami Vivekananda passed in stately erectness up the aisle to the platform. He began to speak, and memory, time, place, people all melted away. Nothing was left but a voice ringing through the void. It was as if a gate had swung open and I'd passed out on a road leading to limitless attainment. The end of it was not visible, but the promise of what it would be shone through the thought and flashed through the personality of the one who gave it. He stood there, prophet of infinitude." For the next 2 years, Glenn attended every Vivekananda lecture and class. Strangely, she never had much personal contact with him. She herself wondered if it was shyness or strangeness or the prejudice of her elder sister, who wished she, quote, "could get salvation closer to home." In any case, she was among a faithful group that followed Vivekananda whenever and wherever he spoke, focusing entirely on his message. The final lecture was in the Madison Square Concert Hall and was historic as it was the only time Vivekananda lectured on my master. Typically, he would not speak of his guru, Ramakrishna, as he thought he represented him so poorly. On this occasion, he seemed reluctant, but once he embarked on his subject, it overtook him. Glenn wrote, quote, "The force of it drove him from one end of the platform to the other. It overflowed in a swift-running stream of eloquence and feeling. The large audience listened in awed stillness, and at the close, many left the hall without speaking. As for myself, I was transfixed. The transcendent picture drawn overwhelmed me. The call had come, and I answered." Although Glenn did not become personally connected to Vivekananda, she became very good friends with Ellen Waldo, who was his right-hand woman, as it were. Waldo was cultured and well-read and did everything possible for Vivekananda, from cooking and cleaning to dictation, editing, and proofreading, to teaching and seeing visitors. In fact, it was Waldo who took down his Raja Yoga in longhand and saw it through to publication. Sometime after Vivekananda left New York, Glenn did the same, citing concerns about what her life would become. Quote, "I had fled from the hurried life of New York to the calmer atmosphere of Boston and was spending my days in seclusion and silence. One afternoon, as I sat alone in my living room, troubling over my aimless future, suddenly 2 figures stood before me. The face of one shone with a super-earthly smile, which seemed to shed an effulgence over his whole being. In quiet tones, he spoke these words, 'Do not grieve, you have work to do for me.' Then both figures vanished, but the sense of their presence lingered for many days." Glenn moved back to New York in 1902 and became a member of the New York Vedanta Society, headed by Swami Abhedananda. This particularly strengthened the friendship between Glenn and Waldo, who was unable to continue her literary work due to poor eyesight. Glenn was given charge of the publishing department, where her first task was the editing and publication of the 2 volumes of Vivekananda's Jnana Yoga. In this role, Glenn was frequently in discussions with Abhedananda. Quote, "One afternoon late, he called me to his private duty to talk over a new publication. As I entered the room, My eyes fell on a photograph hanging over the mantel. I stood still, transfixed. It was the figure I had seen in Boston. I walked quickly across the fireplace and asked almost abruptly, "Of whom is this a picture?" The head of the work replied quietly, "It is my master, Sri Ramakrishna." The following year, the anniversary of Sri Ramakrishna's birthday was observed with a day-long period of fasting, meditation, prayer, and reading. During the last hour, participants were told that whatever they asked for in this final moment of the day would be granted. Glenn could think of nothing to ask for except one, to see Sri Ramakrishna again. Quote, "The stillness in the room was breathless. Something impelled me to open my eyes, and there on the platform, amid the masses of flowers which had been brought in as offering, stood the living presence." It was the same figure that had come to me in Boston, yet not the same, for it was clothed in a single long white garment, and both body and robe were so shining, so transparent, that I could discern through them the faint outline of the flowers behind. But the smile on the face was the same, and there radiated from it the same power, the same gentle benediction. The figure stood there for a few seconds with hands outstretched in blessing, then was gone. I looked about. All eyes were closed. Had no other seen? That fall, Glenn undertook intensive spiritual practices at the Society, which carefully regulated her entire day, including her publication work and practices in posture, breathing, concentration, and meditation on a particular object. Prior to this practice, she had meditated on Ramakrishna, but found after some weeks of the new practice that it felt dry and mechanical. She appealed to Vedanta and was given permission to return to Ramakrishna as the object of her meditation. In her apartment, she had fitted a private chapel. Quote, "That night, I entered this with a new eagerness. I took my place before the altar, went through my exercises, and was just beginning my meditation when Sri Ramakrishna stood before me. Not the Ramakrishna of Boston or of the birthday, but a colossal figure made of pure light with glistening garments. Overawed, I fell on my face before it, crept slowly nearer, and laid my forehead on the feet. I knew no more. When I returned to normal consciousness, I found I'd been lying in front of the altar for more than an hour. What transpired in that hour I shall never know, but it left me with a new outlook on life, a new vision in my heart." At the hour of meditation on the following evening, Sri Ramakrishna came again in his usual form, but surrounded by a glowing light. As I gazed at him in devout wonder, he cast off his body as he might a garment and stood clothed in light. He seemed, however, less overwhelming, less awe-inspiring than at the first coming. A subtler tenderness lingered like a fragrance about him, taking away all sense of awe or fear. A third day, he came again at the hour of prayer. He looked more like the photograph over the mantel, which had first told me of him, but his body seemed only a lantern in which burned a dazzling flame, sending out broad beams of light all about him. No word was spoken, neither on this nor on the previous days, but from a silence that was radiant and charged with meaning, I had learned that whether clothed in an earthly body or manifest in super-earthly glory, Sri Ramakrishna was a living presence, moving among men to aid and bless, to guide and shield in the fullness of his love. The descriptions of Ramakrishna's appearances we've just heard come from an amazing article titled "The Living Presence" that Sister Devamata, which is the monastic name Glenn later received and which we will now refer to her by, wrote for Vedanta Keshari and was published in the February-March issue of 1936. In the Vedanta tradition, the relating of one's spiritual experiences is generally discouraged, sometimes on the grounds that the experiences will not continue if publicized. Devamata herself wrote in the beginning of the article, quote, "I shrink from setting down on the printed page experiences so sacred and personal that I have never voiced them save to one. But what pertains to the great ones of the earth cannot be hidden. It belongs to all persons, not to an individual." In spite of her own long-standing reservations about sharing these experiences, for the first of them must have happened well over 30 years before the article was written, Devamata felt a responsibility to publish them. She wrote, quote, "If the seers of ancient India, or the mystics of medieval Europe, or all those who have seen and heard, had locked their visions in the deep recesses of their hearts and kept them secret, the world would have been incalculably poorer. So now as the sun nears its setting, I break the silence of years and share this spiritual confidence of my life in the hope that through it others may gain a deeper realization of the spiritual grandeur and boundless mercy of one of the greatest among the great ones who've come to earth as saviors of men." Not only was Devamata convinced of her duty to others in describing the appearances, she carefully explained what they were and what they were not. Quote, "They were not psychic visions, they were not dreams, they were not imaginations, nor was the great one who came in them an apparition. He was a pulsing presence, a living personality. The warmth and radiance of his being were clearly perceptible, and my being also, when the presence came, there was a peculiar, unaccustomed glow. It was as if a bright light was flashed on in every atom of my mind and heart, and even in the body. Sometimes the glow preceded the presence, as if to herald its approach. Sometimes it came with it, but always its influence lingered after, for hours and even days." As we've heard from her own writing, Devamata's descriptions of these appearances by Ramakrishna are extraordinary. For one thing, they happened to a Caucasian woman born in Cincinnati, Ohio, who never had seen or knew what Ramakrishna looked like before the appearances began. They all occurred in this country. We're familiar with Ramakrishna appearing to Holy Mother as she was about to remove her ornaments after he died. He also appeared to a number of the direct disciples, including at times almost daily to Swami Brahmananda. But these were all people, and mostly Indian men, who had been intimately connected with Ramakrishna when he was alive. Devamata never had that opportunity, and probably never heard of Ramakrishna until well after he died. Devamata's accounts of Ramakrishna's appearances are also notable for their impact. Rarely are accounts of visions so carefully and so eloquently expressed as those we read from Devamata. Many people have reported visions of Jesus and Mary, but very few are documented with such inspiring detail. By the time Devamata wrote this article, she had authored or edited over a dozen books and pamphlets and many articles. Her intellectual and literary abilities were obvious early in her life, and she used them to full advantage in her devotional service. Her writing is direct and straightforward, yet very powerful and descriptive in its complete expression of her ideas. In her accounts of the appearances of Ramakrishna, we are given first-hand, imagination-stirring accounts of what it was like to experience Ramakrishna's living presence. 4 months after the last appearance we read, Devamata was asked to prepare a collection of the sayings of Ramakrishna for Swami Vivekananda, who didn't have time to do it himself. Over the course of 3 months, from February to April, she collected and categorized nearly 700 sayings, something that gave her great joy. Quote, "The final copy of the manuscript was nearing completion. I was working on it busily one morning when I felt a tapping on my shoulder. I was alone in my apartment, so I thought that some moisture had condensed on the skylight overhead and was dripping down. My living room was really a studio. I put up my hand to brush away the drops and went on with my typewriting. Again, the tapping came. There could be no doubt it was a human touch. Startled, I turned quickly and saw Sri Ramakrishna standing just behind me on the left side. He looked as in his picture and was impressively living. I seemed to feel the warmth of his hand as it rested on my shoulder. No light shone from him, only the radiance of his smile made him luminous. He was dominantly a living human presence. He remained for a brief moment, then disappeared. Can we even imagine what this was like? Ramakrishna not only appeared standing behind Devamata, but is tapping and resting his hand on her shoulder. She was literally touched by God. Then he disappears. What in the world would we do? Would we question our sanity? As Swami Chaitananda sometimes says, would we call 911? Of course, by this time, presumably Devamata was somewhat used to Ramakrishna's uninvited appearances, so it became another in a series of incredible blessings. We will hear of others as we proceed through Devamata's life. To put our narrative in context, we need to understand the background of Vedanta in New York after Vivekananda. Swami Abhedananda, a direct disciple of Ramakrishna, came to America in 1897 after a year in England. He quickly began extensive lectures, often to large groups on the edges of American religion, like spiritualists and New Thought and mental science. He also gave much thought to the organization of the New York Vedanta Society by incorporating it, creating a board of trustees, and buying a house instead of renting halls for lectures. With the creation of a Vedanta press, books, pamphlets, and the Vedanta Monthly Bulletin were made available throughout the country. A decided intellectual, well conversant with Western philosophy and science, he was, however, found wanting by some followers who wanted a personal relationship with the Swami. In 1906, Abhedananda returned from a trip to India with Swami Paramananda, who had been recruited to serve as his assistant in New York. Paramananda was Vivekananda's youngest disciple, and with an engaging, affectionate nature, he quickly became a favorite of the society. As soon as Laura Glenn saw Paramananda, she recognized him as the second figure in her first vision of Ramakrishna in Boston. The two bonded immediately, and in March 1907, Paramananda initiated her with the name Devamata, literally, Mother of God. At the time, Devamata was 40 years old and Paramananda 23, so she was old enough to be his mother. And in fact, his letters to her were always addressed to Mother Dear and signed, Your Son. He also never failed to stand up whenever she entered the room. In spite of this highly spiritual and respectful relationship between them, Abhedananda's supporters disapproved, particularly of Paramananda being Devamata's guru, a role usually reserved for the head of the work. In A Bridge of Dreams, Sarah Ann Levinsky's fine biography of Swami Paramananda, she observes that the tension in the society was not only friction between old students and new students, but between the jnani, or path of knowledge followers of Abhedananda, who formed the majority of the society, and the bhakta, or path of devotion followers strongly drawn to the devotional Paramananda. Levinsky describes an incident from the book of Mrs. Mary LePage, one of the jnanis, which illustrates the problem. LePage, quote, was cleaning and preparing the society's library for Swami Abhedananda's weekly reception of callers. When she had finished, Miss Glenn, an ardent bhakta, rearranged the Swami's chair so his back would not be to the altar, in accordance with the principle that an altar must be treated like a living presence. He never sits with his back to Sri Ramakrishna's picture, she explained. Mrs. LePage protested, but the sun will be in his eyes and he cannot see his visitor. Miss Glenn turned the chair again, saying, "Well, put it this way." "Yes," came Mrs. LePage, "and then the visitor cannot see the Swami. After all, is God only on the altar? I supposed he was everywhere." Miss Glenn, who was her senior both by age and by tenure in the society, insisted that the altar must be respected, and then left. As soon as she was out of the door, the indomitable Mrs. Page restored the original arrangement. In April 1907, the society moved into new headquarters, but without first setting aside a shrine and installing the Lord, which would have been absolutely mandatory for the bhaktas. Paramananda did soon establish a shrine on his own where simple daily offerings were performed. When Swami Ramakrishna, who had mentored Paramananda in Madras, heard about the non-devotional attitude of the society, he wrote to Paramananda, quote, "Vedanta without devotion is no Vedanta at all. One who thinks of egotism as Brahman will never be able to do any good to himself," end quote. As Paramananda's ardent disciple and a confirmed bhakta, Devamata was the target of much calumny at the society, which grieved Paramananda deeply. In order to try to remove her from, quote, the field of battle, after months of tension, at the end of 1907, Paramananda arranged for her to go to India to study under Swami Ramakrishna. One of the things she took with her was a precious, unpublished manuscript. In the summer of 1895, Devamata had been unable to accept Vivekananda's invitation to spend 6 weeks with him and a group of devotees at Thousand Island Park. Yet through what she called a strange turn of circumstances, the task of conveying to the world his teachings from that time fell to her. In the summer of 1907, Devamata was visiting a close friend in Jewett in the Catskill Mountains. A half-mile away was the farmhouse where Ellen Waldo spent her summers, so they saw each other frequently. A short time before Devamata was to leave, Waldo said, "While you were here, I meant to read you my notes of Swamiji's, meaning Vivekananda's, teachings at Thousand Island Park." So for the next 3 afternoons, the notes were read aloud. After the last word had been uttered, Devamata said, quote, "It is criminal for you to keep these notes to yourself. They belong to the world." To which Waldo replied, "They have always seemed to me too fragmentary, too inadequate to publish. If you are willing to take them and work on them and bring them out, I'm glad to pass them over to you." Devamata returned to New York only to get a typewriter and supplies, then came back to Jewett where she rented a quiet room. For the next 6 weeks, she worked on the notes. Each day, Waldo read the notes typed the previous day, often recalling other things Swamiji had said or done, and becoming more and more delighted with the progress. Waldo provided the title, Inspired Talks, but other than that, gave Devamata a free hand in the publishing. But before it could go to the printer, Devamata left for India, and with her, the completed manuscript. As she wrote, quote, "Thus it was that the glowing words of Swami Vivekananda spoken at Thousand Island Park on the banks of the St. Lawrence River, hidden for long years in Brooklyn, prepared for publication in the heart of the Catskill Mountains, 9 miles from any railway, now traveled through the Suez Canal, past the sandy bluffs of the desert of Sahara, across the continent of India, to take form as a book under the burning sky of Madras." It took Devamata 38 years to reach Bombay, 38 days to reach Bombay from New York, then nearly 2 days more to Madras. Though arriving at the train station very early in the morning, she was met by Swami Ramakrishna and at least a dozen others. She was taken first to the shrine at the monastery, then to rooms in the primary school building where she was to live until the house rented for her was available. Each morning at 4 a.m., she was awakened by the deep tones of a man's voice, followed by a high-pitched response from a young boy. It turned out to be a Brahmin guru who came daily to teach Sanskrit chanting to a small boy who lived behind the school and had recently received his sacred thread. Ramakrishna's birthday was chosen as the day for Devamata to occupy her house. It literally became a procession from the monastery to the nearby house, with Ramakrishnananda carrying Devamata's holy pictures and Devamata with lighted incense, followed by devotees of the monastery, then students from the students' home. Quote, the entire front of the house had been decorated. Green festoons hung between the heavy pillars of the veranda, and there were garlands of mango leaves over the entrance. On either side of the steps stood tall banana stalks, and over them hung green coconuts. Arriving in an upper chamber, they made a temporary altar of Devamata's writing desk. Then all sat on straw mats while the students chanted from the Upanishads for half an hour. Devamata soon settled into a daily routine. Waking at 4, at 6:30, she walked to a lovely garden about a mile away. It had been introduced to her by Ramakrishnananda, and then the owner had invited her to come daily to get flowers for worship. Quote, sometimes I went to other gardens, for frequently strange gentlemen would stop me and ask me to come to their garden to gather my day's supply of flowers. Once I tried to go too far, and feeling exhausted, I sat down on the low stone balustrade of a bridge to rest. A gentleman passed. I could see from his turban that he was an official. He hesitated a moment, then came back and said, Sister, you look ill. Can I do anything for you? I explained that I was merely overtired. Let me get you a carriage, was his reply. There is not a family in any one of these houses that would not consider it a privilege to send you home in their carriage. I assured him it was not necessary, and he left me, coming back again to see if I was all right. This was but one of the many expressions of kindliness that came to me constantly. Devamata never writes about her own appearance or clothing, but seeing her in later group pictures with other nuns, she is always one of the shortest. Levinsky noted that her diminutive frame barely reached 5 feet. We usually see her in full white clerical garb, covering everything but her face and hands. Since in taking the name Devamata, she had renounced the world in the Indian tradition, it can be assumed that she wore clerical clothing in India. The gentleman who addressed her as sister must have assumed by her appearance that she was a nun. There must also have been something about her devotional demeanor that encouraged people to treat her with kindness and respect, as she herself reported. In early autumn of that year, Swami Brahmananda, then president of the Ramakrishna order, came to Madras to spend 6 months there. He was very solicitous of Devamata and had her sit by him and told her she must come to the evening service every day. He also questioned her intently about the work in America, particularly what Swami Paramananda was doing, and expressed deep love for him. In general, he was very reticent, though, and whenever someone came to him with a question or problem, he would say, "Go to Swami Ramakrishnananda. He is wise and learning. I know nothing." Devamata observed that Brahmananda's silence was always genial and ventured that it came from long hours of meditation and also from the fact that his mode of thought sought subtler avenues of expression. I remember one early morning when he sent for me to request me to write a preface for Swami Vivekananda's inspired talks, the manuscript of which I had prepared for publication. I brought the finished preface to the monastery in the evening and read it to him. He made no comment, but got up and walked out of the room. I thought he did not like what I had written and determined to try again on the morrow. In a moment, the road, one of the young swamis who had accompanied the president, came from Swami Brahmananda's room with a small bottle in his hand. "Swami Brahmananda," he said, "has asked me to give you some of this sweet perfume." And he sprinkled over my head nearly all of the contents of the bottle. For days it lingered in my veil and hair, conveying to me a fragrant sanction. On another occasion, Devamata spent a whole day repairing a chadar of Brahmananda's, dyeing thread to match and darning every little hole. He was delighted with it and showed it to everyone that I had done it, but he never mentioned it to me. He did not wish to cheapen a loving service by an ordinary expression of thanks. We often cannot get people to even say thanks, but for a very different reason. Those who come to our Christmas program are familiar with Devamata's story of a Christmas party Brahmananda asked her to organize. His request was for it to be as much like a Western Christmas party as you can make it. This meant plum cake, glacé fruits, sweetmeats, and other Christmas goodies. There was no tree, but decorations included jungle branches on the pillars and garlands of mango leaves and jasmine. Devamata read St. Luke's account of Christ's birth, and after finishing turned to Swami Brahmananda. His eyes looked to the altar, but it was obvious he was in another plane of consciousness, which remained for at least 20 minutes. When the company had left, Brahmananda had a little of each item of Western food. Devamata wrote, quote, as he was eating, he remarked to me, I have been very much blessed in coming to your house today, sister. I answered quickly, Swamiji, it is I who have been blessed in having you come. You do not understand, he replied. I've had a great blessing here this afternoon. As you were reading the Bible, Christ suddenly stood before the altar dressed in a long blue cloak. He talked to me for some time. It was a very blessed moment. There was no more thought of food. I poured water over his hands, then some sweet perfume. And with Swami Ramakrishna he went back to the monastery, radiant with the joy of the vision. In the spring, Brahmananda left Madras. Though Devamata had no more personal association with him, he did write occasional and affectionate letters to her. A few days after Devamata had reached Madras, she received a letter from Holy Mother saying that Devamata was her daughter and that she was very glad to hear of her devotion to Ramakrishna. So it was to be with Mother that Devamata made the 40-hour pilgrimage by train to Calcutta. Arriving at Mother's house, she went upstairs to find Mother alone, where she gave her offerings and pranams. Saying Devamata's name twice, Mother then blessed her by putting her hand on Devamata's head. Shortly, one of Mother's attendants came in and began to massage her body. As Devamata watched, she wondered if she would ever be worthy to do the same. Sensing this thought, Mother immediately motioned for Devamata to take over the massage, kneeling beside her. As she was doing so, the marble floor became very hard, and again Mother divined the problem and had Devamata sit instead of kneel. We know that both Ramakrishna and Holy Mother felt pain when touched by impure persons, so it speaks to both Devamata's purity and devotion that she was given the privilege of massaging Holy Mother at their very first meeting. Mother quickly took Devamata into the household, giving her the privilege of caring for Mother's rooms. Noticing that the large French windows on the front veranda were clouded with putty and paint, Devamata brought some monkey brand soap, the equivalent of our Bon Ami. Mother was so pleased with the results that every visitor that day was shown the clear and shining windows. Another day, 2 choice mangoes were brought from Mother. Quote, she wanted me to take them. I refused, knowing they were the last of the season and that she was very fond of them. Quote, it would give me greater pleasure to have you keep them, I said. Her response came quickly. It was, do you think it will give you greater pleasure to have me keep them, or give me greater pleasure to have you take them? This answer sprang spontaneously to my lips and seemed to please her very much. It must give you greater pleasure because you have a larger heart to feel it. Following a return to Madras, and even after returning to America, Devamata and Holy Mother corresponded by letter. Several of Mother's letters are printed in Devamata's book, Days in an Indian Monastery. They were usually addressed to my sweet daughter and signed, your most affectionate mother. While in Calcutta, Devamata made many visits to the Dakshineswar temple to receive the blessings of Ramakrishna's unseen presence that was still to be felt there. Her first visit was with Swami Sardananda and Yoganma, who told her incident after incident of Ramakrishna's life, their personal experiences, and words he had spoken during that time. Her second visit was with M, the recorder of the gospel. With his long white beard and noble, venerable bearing, he seemed a part of the temple spirit as he showed me all the places hallowed by the Master's touch. She also spent an afternoon at the temple with Lakshmi Devi, Ramakrishna's niece, who recounted many other first-hand stories of Ramakrishna. On her last visit to Dakshineswar, Ramakrishna's nephew Ramlal gave her prasad, then picked a large bunch of gardenias to take home with her. The blessing of contacts with these intimates of Ramakrishna made his unseen presence that much more real for her. Devamata's time in Calcutta also provided contact with many other disciples of Ramakrishna. Swami Adbhutananda, Latu Maharaj, liked the Western bread and butter Devamata brought him. Swami Sardananda impressed her with his gentle dignity and loving kindness. She saw Swami Premananda frequently, who later wrote lengthy letters to her. One such letter concluded, quote, reminding you that the relationship in which you stand to us is a relation in the Lord, and as such, eternal and unchanging. I remain, yours affectionately, Premananda. Girish Ghosh told her of his first meeting with Ramakrishna. Devamata thought Golap Ma was fond of Sister Nivedita, Sister Christine, and herself, even though they were not Brahmins. Yoganma, Devamata thought, quote, had only one unchanging mood, which took outward form in fervent devotion to her master and loving care of his children. When Holy Mother found out that Devamata wouldn't be there to attend a celebration at Kankargachi, she arranged a special party for her there with 25 ladies in attendance. When they began to serve refreshments, Devamata went off by herself, knowing the reservations some of the Indian ladies might have about eating with a non-Indian. So she was surprised when Golap Ma called her name and beckoned her to come to the party pavilion. She continued beckoning until Devamata came to the place reserved for her, where Golap Ma provided a leaf plate with food. Devamata wrote, it was a triumph over caste and race and creed, and showed the reality of Sri Ramakrishna's unifying influence. While in Calcutta, Devamata stayed at the Nivedita Girls' School and associated closely with Sister Christine, who acted as principal there. As Devamata's time allowed, she occasionally conducted English classes. There seems to have been a general understanding that Devamata, like Nivedita and Christine, had come to India to spend her life in service there. However, she was still very much tied to Paramananda in America. While still en route to India, she wrote to him, the greater the outer distance that separates us, the closer will our hearts cling together. As soon as she learned that he had left New York and was working alone in Boston, she longed to return and help him. Paramananda, too, wished that she was there to help him, but left the decision entirely to her, regarding it all to be Mother's will. When Devamata sailed for New York from Bombay in September 1909, many people thought it was for a brief visit home. Holy Mother, however, knew differently and had said to her, Devamata, be careful. If you get even the hem of your garment caught in the American work, you will not get back. Levinsky observes, hem and heart were already caught. She never returned. During the time Devamata was in India, the situation at the New York Vedanta Society had deteriorated to the point that Paramananda left to start work in Boston. This too provided unexpected trials for him, so after Devamata returned from India in late 1909, Paramananda, Devamata, and Mrs. Ruckert, a friend from New York, traveled to begin work in Washington, D.C. Here Devamata served much the same function as Ellen Waldo had for Vivekananda, a one-person staff encompassing housekeeping, laundry, and cooking, plus being the center's administrator, secretary, and publicist. As usual, she served with, quote, tireless dedication and zeal. The response in Washington, however, was mediocre. Levinsky pointed out that while the people of Boston battled about religion, they cared about it. The people of Washington, however, cared about politics and diplomacy and were often indifferent to religion. When an opportunity to return to Boston became available, Paramananda took it, leaving Devamata to continue work in Washington. At this second attempt, Paramananda's work in Boston prospered to the point that he chose to remain there, even when the New York Society offered him charge when Vedanta moved permanently to the Society's Connecticut retreat. Although the Washington, D.C. Center was not thriving, there was a nucleus of students that Paramananda wanted to support. So he devised a plan where he and Devamata would alternate between Boston and Washington. With her many talents and deep understanding of Vedanta and Ramakrishna's disciples and gift for leadership, Devamata was a natural partner in this endeavor. It was also revolutionary in that it was the first time that a woman was given the chance to teach Vedanta on a regular basis. Levinsky writes, quote, Paramananda accorded men and women the same opportunities, not because he was a militant feminist, but because it never occurred to him to do otherwise. In many ways, Paramananda and Devamata were opposite in temperaments. Paramananda was gentle, engaging, boyish, and personal. He was more interested in developing the individual than the movement. Devamata was tirelessly energetic, intellectual, devoted, but firm in her insistence on organization, rules, and dignified promotion. Observing her in Madras, Ramakrishna had warned Paramananda of her slight tendency to boss. These opposing tendencies, however, made them a good partnership, much like Vivekananda and Waldo, with Paramananda's spiritual inspiration and Devamata's attention to practical details. In 1911, Paramananda left for a trip to India, spurred in part by disquieting reports of Ramakrishna's health. Unfortunately, Ramakrishna died before Paramananda reached Madras. While in India, he wrote Devamata to concentrate her efforts on the successful Boston Center, where a second apartment was rented as a home for Devamata and other women who wished to offer service. The Washington Center then became a branch of Boston, and Devamata conducted one season of lectures and classes there each year until 1917, when they were discontinued entirely. When Paramananda returned from New York, he came with renewed zeal for his mission. The work in Boston mushroomed, with a new emphasis on spreading Vedanta through publishing. The plan included books compiled from Swami's lectures and a monthly magazine, The Message of the East, which was to include, quote, lectures of Vivekananda, Ramakrishna and Paramananda, articles by Devamata, juxtapositions of quotations from Eastern and Western thinkers, prayers, poems, and reports of the Boston work and the Vedanta movement in America and India. Much of this responsibility fell to Devamata, who was not only in charge of the Boston Center while the Swami was away, but also the publications department. While Paramananda was officially editor of the magazine, it was Devamata who kept it going, transcribing and editing lectures for inclusion, choosing and writing articles and other material. She was also, quote, emerging as a teacher in her own right. Not only did she conduct all services during the absences, but also she was frequently invited for outside speaking engagements. And during her ever shorter visits to Washington, students flocked to her for private guidance. As Kennard Nelson, one of the earliest Vedanta followers, who was a staunch admirer of Devamata, said, when she lectured, students from local colleges sat on the edges of their seats, catching every word. She had much wisdom, had an answer for every question, and seemed to know everything. With the increased success of Paramananda and Devamata's lectures and growing respect for the work in Boston, in 1914 they were able to purchase a beautiful home on Queensbury Street on the most desirable corner of the Fenway. The location enhanced their respectability, and with it came more devotees. Between 130 and 160 people were coming each Sunday morning. By 1921, the house was well filled, primarily with sisters, but also two men who became brothers. Included was Devamata's 80-year-old mother, And, quote, when Mrs. Glenn fell and broke her hip, it gave ample opportunity for service to those who liked to serve and to some who did not. Levinsky writes, quote, the paradox of the Vedanta Center community was that, although founded by the freedom-loving Paramananda, it was molded by the strict Sister Devamata. While he stood before them and beckoned, she stood behind them and pushed. Sister Doya later chose two quotations from the New Testament to epitomize the training techniques of the Swami and the senior sister. For Paramananda, it was, come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For Devamata, whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. In addition to all her other responsibilities with a literally full house, it was decided to add a 4-story and a new wing. So Devamata became the construction supervisor as well. She drove herself relentlessly and did the same for everyone else, expecting perfection from others and becoming annoyed at their lapse. The result was tangible tension in the community. As she later wrote, she had grown, quote, harsh and critical and out of rhythm. Her rascal ego, like most of ours, had insinuated itself. We should not think, however, that Devamata was only the stern taskmaster and prioress. Levinsky writes, quote, to the public who frequented the Vedanta Center, she was an affectionate, gracious, and witty hostess. Her files are full of letters from the Swami's students in America and abroad, thanking her for her kindnesses, for her loving notes, and for her faithful remembrance of some long-distant devotee. When balance cannot be maintained, a crisis is perhaps inevitable. In March 1922, after delivering a lecture to an audience of 1,000 on the conquest of fear in Memphis, Paramananda received a wire which caused him to cancel all other engagements and return immediately to Boston. Sister Devamata had collapsed. It was initially thought to be a nervous breakdown caused by the stress of the last year, but tests eventually revealed encephalitis, which was untreatable at the time. Although death had been declared imminent by the doctors, Paramananda organized a round-the-clock vigil to save her. Laying prostrate in the shrine, praying for her life, eventually, quote, he heard a voice, which he took to be the messenger of death, say, very well, but you will pay for this. In the middle of that night, Devamata, quote, suddenly felt a heavy burden drop from her. She who for days had been too weak even to move, rose from her bed and walked across the large room to the chair. The registered nurse who came on duty at dawn would not have been surprised to find her patient dead, but she was shocked to find her sitting in her room in the chair across the room. Although she did not die, Devamata did not completely recover either. She was partially paralyzed, which made her walking difficult, and her speech was somewhat garbled, which put an end to her public lectures. Previously, such a dynamic figure that she was thought to be in every place of the house at once, she was now a partial invalid, moving slowly and with much effort. While she could not now channel her energy in a physical way, it certainly expressed itself through her literary and publishing efforts. During her 2 years in India, from 1907 to 1909, Devamata had steeped herself in Indian religion and culture, noting every possible detail. She now had time to edit those observations and interactions with Ramakrishna's disciples and devotees, which were published in Days in an Indian Monastery in 1927. It was well regarded even by the Indian press and is still in print today and well worth reading. She wrote a biography of Ramakrishna and one of Paramananda, and in an impressive undertaking, she culled inspirational words from Paramananda's letters, talks, writings, and poems into 4 headings for each day of the year in the Book of Daily Thoughts and Prayers. It is also still in print. I read it every day. Her writing also appeared in numerous articles for the monthly Message from the East, and she maintained correspondence with numerous friends and devotees throughout the world. The historian Carl Jackson wrote about Paramananda in his book Vedanta for the West. Quote, "No Ramakrishna monk met the American challenge more successfully than Paramananda, who established flourishing Vedanta societies in Boston and Los Angeles and achieved unprecedented acceptance by the American public." Paramananda had lectured and traveled widely, not only through the United States, but in Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, and everywhere people clamored for him to start Vedanta centers. Ultimately, though, in part due to World War I, he concentrated on Boston and Los Angeles, shuttling between the two with travel breaks and lectures midway in Cincinnati, and often in Louisville, Chicago, St. Louis, or Dayton. In 1923, land was purchased in the foothills of the Sierra Madre Mountains in California and established as Ananda Ashrama, headquarters of the Western work. Devamata and two other sisters moved to California later that year, calling themselves the Ashrama Pioneers. And indeed, they were pioneers, at first living in a house without phone or electricity and chilled in spite of a fireplace, which Devamata insisted must first be lit only by the hand of the teacher according to the Indian tradition, since it was a holy dwelling. Devamata's health also vacillated between periods when she was helpful and independent and times when she needed care from others. One morning in 1934, after offering flowers to Ramakrishna, she fell, stepping back, fracturing her leg. The treatment was 3 months in a cast from above her waist to her right foot and knee. With characteristic determination, she vowed to benefit from this trial, and though immobilized, dictated a booklet, The Companionship of Pain. She wrote, quote, "Physical ailments are not a misfortune. They are often remedies for deeper sicknesses of mind or heart or character. They cure by chastening. They make us brave, strong, and enduring. Pain allied with spirit heals and exalts. It makes heroes of men." She had to draw on this strength later in life, too, when she developed Parkinson's and eventually became wheelchair-bound. Regardless, her mind and spirit must have been exalted, as sometime after healing from the fracture, the living presence that was Ramakrishna returned. I can do no better than read her own captivating words. Quote, "Gradually various buildings were erected, among them an impressive temple dedicated to the universal spirit. I formed the habit of going to the sanctuary of the temple for a quiet hour of prayer after the household had retired for the night. Thus it was that late one night I mounted the steps to the upper terrace and unlocked the side door of the temple. It seemed very big, very dark, and very still as I entered. I was glad to escape from this silent outer emptiness to the more protecting space of the dimly lit inner sanctuary. I knelt before the altar and began repeating a sacred name. I do not know how long I had been kneeling there when noiselessly and quite naturally the walls behind the altar rolled back. My eyes rested on the vista of hills beyond without surprise or wonder. It seemed in no way extraordinary that I should see them. As my gaze lifted from hill to hill, it was drawn to a blazing light on the highest peak. In the center of the light stood the living presence. A long shawl fell about it, the color of which was neutralized by the dazzling light. The face shone with a super-earthly effulgence, and from the outstretched hands there poured a radiant blessing. The figure stood thus for a moment, then began to descend towards the temple, did not follow the slope of the hill, but moved on a direct path of light. As it drew nearer, I could discern that the light which created the path came from the feet of the one who walked upon it. Downward, the presence moved on the shining band of light, majestic, silent, awe-inspiring, yet radiating such tenderness of love that all sense of fear or marvel melted. It approached slowly, reached the temple, entered the sanctuary through the open walls, which rolled together and took its place on the right side of the altar with the hand resting on it. The transfiguring light dimmed, and Sri Ramakrishna of the hilltop became the Ramakrishna of his earthly embodiment. He looked as when he walked visibly among men. He stood in smiling silence for a moment, then began to speak. What he uttered was spoken to the heart rather than to the ear, and was meant only for the one who had heard. It was very late when I left the sanctuary. The figure still stood beside the altar, and for 4 days, whenever I entered the temple at the hour of worship, I saw it there, more real and glowing than those who knelt in prayer before the sanctuary gate. The temple was charged with the power of its presence. Several years stretch between this and Sri Ramakrishna's next coming. The gap is in the narrative alone. Only a few salient experiences are included in it. To translate into the written word the close association of the present with my daily life would be impossible. It guarded my safety, guided my effort, enveloped me with a love that renewed, healed, and sweetened. All it asked in return was the devotion of a humble heart. I was still living at Ananda Ashrama. The winter nights in California are cold and often stormy. To avoid exposure to the occasional inclement weather, I was persuaded to abandon going to the temple for the late hour of prayer and to fit up, next to my study, a private chapel. 10 years' residence in Europe had enabled me to gather many things to make a chapel lovely. Among them was a rare hanging, several centuries old, which had hung in the chancel arch of a Spanish church. It had been woven by the monks of Salamanca and also embroidered by them. Even the embroidery silk was the product of their own silkworms. The hanging had taken form and served always in holy surroundings. Sanctity pervaded it, and it seemed to belong where we placed it, on the wall behind the altar. When the chapel was finished, it was so filled with uplifted beauty and power that I could not keep it for myself. I began to share it with others. Those who saw it asked to bring friends to its door. Others heard of it and begged the privilege of seeing it. So many came. Not one ever stood at its threshold for a moment of silent prayer who did not thank me with tear-filled eyes for the blessing received. There were some in the household, however, who criticized me for showing it so freely. They felt that a personal shrine should be kept for that person alone. Their thought troubled me not a little. I shrank from desecrating anything so sacred as was the little chapel to me. I determined to let a higher power decide it. I went to the temple and made appeal for guidance. No answer came. But later, when I opened the door of the little chapel, I was amazed to find it apparently empty of furnishings. Only the hanging remained. Before it stood Sri Ramakrishna, his face alight with that radiant smile which seemed a very part of him. He held out his hands as if in tender greeting and said to me, "This is the welcome I give to all who come here." I knew now why everyone who came to the little chapel felt there was the power of a great presence. Sister Devamata passed from this world quietly and suddenly in December 1942. Beyond a shadow of doubt, she was a blessed one, for she lived her life in the daily company of that living presence. May we all come to know that presence which lives within us and may be called forth by intensity of devotion. That is my prayer for all of us today. Thou alone art my Father, Thou alone art my mother, Thou alone art my friend, Thou alone art my companion, Thou alone art my wisdom, Thou alone art my strength, Thou alone art my all in all, O God of gods. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.